Community college nurses don't belong in critical care. That is what Dr. Ashford said 17 minutes before the major in room for 47 opened his eyes for the first time in 3 years. Margaret Walsh doesn't remember deciding to become a nurse. She remembers deciding to stop being a soldier. The ICU at Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston runs at 2:47 a.m. like a cathedral of machines, fluorescent lights casting green phosphorescence across monitors that beep in irregular rhythms, each pulse a heartbeat someone else's body forgot how to maintain on its own. Margaret moves through the ward with the kind of efficiency that comes not from training but from muscle memory, from hands that once knew how to stop bleeding in a sandstorm and now know how to adjust a drip rate without waking the patient. The trauma shears clipped to her scrub pocket catch the light. Reaper 06 is engraved on the handle, the letters worn smooth from 6 years of her thumb running across them like a prayer she'll never speak aloud. Room for 47 is at the far end of the ICU, the last room before the supply closet, the one where families stop coming after month 2. The chart reads 3 years unresponsive. Blunt force trauma to the head. Extensive surgical repair. Prognosis, vegetative state, indefinite. The major in the bed doesn't move when she checks his lines. His left eye is slightly more open than his right, a detail no one else seems to notice, the kind of asymmetry that means something to someone trained to read the smallest signs of life. Margaret's hands freeze for just a moment on the IV catheter. His face is older now, weathered by 3 years of institutional fluorescence and morphine drips, but the jaw is the same. The scar tissue on his left cheekbone is the same. This is Captain James Holloway. This is the man who stood in front of a court-martial board 6 years ago in the Hindu Kush and listened while Margaret Walsh took the blame for his mistake, a tactical decision that cost 2 operators their lives and would have ended his career if she hadn't volunteered to carry it instead. She had whispered one sentence to him before the hearing, "Tell them I gave the advance order." He had nodded. He had believed her. And then they both had walked away, him to recovery, her to dissolution. She steadies her breathing. Just a patient now. Just another chart, another set of vitals, another body suspended between living and whatever comes after. The break room smells like burnt coffee and antiseptic, that particular chemical marriage that defines hospital air at 3 in the morning. Margaret pours from the carafe using both hands, a habit she's never broken, because the tremor in her left fingers is still there on certain nights, and she learned long ago that some people notice shaking hands. Other nurses call her the ghost because she works exclusively nights, because she speaks to no one outside of patient care, because her locker contains nothing personal, no photos, no magnets, no evidence of a life outside these walls. What they don't know is that the tremor isn't fear. It's the opposite. It's restraint. It's what happens when hands remember holding a rifle and choose instead to hold a stethoscope. The coffee cup reads "A world's okayest nurse" in faded letters, a gift from her sister 3 years ago, the only thing anyone has ever given her that she's kept at work. Margaret. The night supervisor, Chen, appears in the doorway with a chart. Dr. Ashford is coming up for rounds in 5 minutes. He wants to review medication protocols with the entire evening team. Margaret nods. She has worked under Dr. Ashford for the past 18 months, long enough to understand the pattern. He arrives in the ICU at intervals that don't correlate with patient emergencies. He spends time at the medication cart. He reviews her charts with an intensity that exceeds clinical necessity. She has said nothing about any of it. Saying things gets you noticed. Being noticed gets you asked questions. Questions lead to backgrounds being checked, and Margaret Walsh's background ends in a redacted file in the Pentagon that would take approximately 14 minutes to surface if anyone decided to look. Dr. Ashford walks into the conference room at 3:05 a.m. with the kind of confidence that comes from generational wealth and a medical degree from Johns Hopkins. His shoes cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. His watch is a Rolex, the kind that sits on the wrist like a status announcement. He is handsome in the way that privilege always is, unfurrowed brow, straight teeth, the absence of anything that resembles struggle or consequence. Around him moves the immediate air of deference. These are good doctors, Margaret has observed. They are also afraid of him. Not because he is a better clinician, she has seen his work, and it is competent but not exceptional, but because something about his presence makes the normal rules of human interaction feel negotiable. He smiles rarely. When he does, it is not warm. Let's discuss medication protocols, Dr. Ashford says, settling into the chair at the head of the table. 20 colleagues fill the conference room. Margaret sits in the second to last row. I want to revisit some of the evening staff's choices. Margaret Walsh, you're using a lot of atypical antipsychotics on the long-term comatose patients. Walk me through your clinical reasoning. Margaret straightens slightly. The question is legitimate. The tone is not. She begins, the literature shows reduced incidence of. The literature, Dr. Ashford interrupts, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone performing contempt for an audience, also shows that community college nurses shouldn't be making pharmaceutical decisions at all. You have what? An associate's degree? 2-year program? And you're standing here telling me about clinical reasoning. The room does not move. No one looks at Margaret. This is the ritual. The cut is made. The audience watches. The victim either bleeds or doesn't. Margaret feels the small muscles along her jaw tighten, one breath in, one breath held, one breath released without sound. Her hands remain flat on the table. My patients are alive, Dr. Ashford, she says, her voice level as a surgical instrument. How are yours? The silence in the room is the kind that has texture. She can feel it against her skin like humidity before a storm. Dr. Ashford's smile doesn't change, but something in his eyes recalibrates. He has expected tears, or anger, or defensive stammering. What he has received instead is an answer so perfectly composed that the insult rebounds backward, and he knows it. 20 colleagues feel it simultaneously. The power dynamic has shifted in a way that cannot be undone in this room. He will have to recalibrate outside this space, in the corridors and the parking garage and the medication records, where witnesses are fewer and consequences are easier to control. Interesting perspective, he says, and the meeting continues, but no one speaks to Margaret again, and she takes it as the warning it is. At 4:17 a.m., she is in room 447 adjusting the major's morphine drip when she hears voices in the medication storage area next door. The door is propped open. She can see into the supply room. Dr. Ashford is there with a man she doesn't recognize, someone in business casual, someone whose posture suggests authority that has nothing to do with medicine. They are not loud. They do not touch the medication stock. They are reviewing a ledger. A physical ledger. An actual piece of paper that should not exist in a modern hospital's medication tracking system. The quantity discrepancies are getting harder to explain, the man is saying. His voice sounds like it comes from money and litigation. We need to close this out. 2 more months, Dr. Ashford replies. The supplies are ordered, delivered, logged. We document partial usage. The hospital systems show depletion. The actual inventory goes to Bellworth Medical Supply, they bill us for replacement stock, and the difference flows through their accounts. It's clean. Margaret keeps her hand on the fall line. She doesn't move. Doesn't look. Doesn't do anything that would signal that she is listening, but every neuron in her system has fired a high alert because she understands what she is hearing, a medication kickback scheme. Benzodiazepines being ordered in excess, documented as used, actually diverted to a secondary supplier, the hospital charged full price for missing inventory, the gap filled by kickback payments to Ashford filtered through prescription pads and pharmaceutical vendor relationships. Probably $300,000 a quarter. Maybe more. The kind of scheme that requires corrupted pharmacy software, which means corrupted charts, which means corrupted records, which means... Her hand trembles on the fall line. Not from fear. From the weight of what happens next. I understand, the man says. But the audit schedule is accelerating. Someone's looking at Q3 variance reports. We need to ensure the numbers align. Leave that to me, Dr. Ashford replies, and Margaret hears the sound of the ledger closing, footsteps on tile, the supply room door swinging shut. She stands in room for 47 for 6 minutes without moving. The Major's monitor beeps its steady rhythm. Room for 47. 3 years. The court-martial. The lie she told to save his career. The career she destroyed instead by taking blame that wasn't hers, by walking away from everything, by becoming a ghost in a hospital in Houston where she thought no one would ever know her name. The fluorescent lights hum above her head. Somewhere down the corridor, Dr. Ashford is adjusting medication records. Somewhere in the hospital, the evidence of his crimes is accumulating in a system designed to catch exactly this kind of discrepancy if anyone looks hard enough. Margaret pulls her hands into fists, and for just a moment, she lets herself remember what it felt like to carry a rifle instead of a stethoscope, to operate in a world where the rules were explicit and the stakes were clear and you didn't have to pretend to be powerless while powerful men made decisions that killed people. She opens her hands. She looks at the Major's chart. She checks the next room's vitals. And she begins the careful work of documenting everything she heard, in the smallest possible notations, in places that only someone looking for evidence would ever find, because that's what you do when you understand that the person who destroyed you 6 years ago is about to destroy her again, unless she moves first. But that wasn't the worst part. The parking garage elevator smelled like stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the fluorescent panels casting everything in a sickly pale light. Margaret stepped inside at 3:47 p.m., her 12-hour shift ending, her shoulders carrying the weight of 3 years of night shifts and 2 years of watching a man she'd once been ordered to forget lie unconscious in room for 47. The door slid shut with a hydraulic wheeze. She pressed the button for level 3 where her car waited. The elevator descended. 1 floor. 2. At level 3, she reached for the doors. They were already opening when Dr. Ashford stepped through the gap from the other side, his $3,200 suit immaculate, his hair perfectly gelled, his presence filling the small metal box like cold water. He didn't say anything. He simply raised his arm and blocked the closing doors with his forearm, his watch catching the fluorescent light, his smile exactly the smile of someone who owned the space he occupied. The doors froze open. Margaret stood on the other side of the elevator, her hand still extended, her scrubs damp from 12 hours of work, her badge hanging at her hip next to the trauma shears she kept in her pocket, the ones with Reaper 6 engraved on the handle from her combat medic days, a call sign no one here knew was hers. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. She simply waited. 45 seconds passed. The silence wasn't empty. It was occupied. It pressed against her like physical weight, the kind of manufactured discomfort designed to make someone speak first, to fill the void with apology or explanation or fear. His arm remained steady across the doorway. His eyes met hers. His smile didn't waver. The elevator's mechanical hum filled the gap between them. 50 seconds now. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, the breathing of a man who had practiced this, the intimidation, the power move, the calculated display of dominance in a confined space where someone couldn't run. This was not a doctor checking on a patient. This was not a colleague sharing an elevator. This was a man who had witnessed her watching him alter medication records at 1:47 a.m., and this was his response. Margaret's jaw tightened. One single muscle, one tiny movement. 60 seconds. He dropped his arm. Stepped aside. The smile widened. "Have a good evening, Margaret." She didn't respond. She moved past him into the garage, her boots clicking on concrete, her breathing unchanged, her composure intact. But her hands knew. The hands that had held pressure on a severed femoral artery in the Hindu Kush, the hands that had kept a dying captain's airway open while rounds came through a mud wall, those hands understood exactly what had just happened. This wasn't intimidation. This was escalation. This was a man running out of patience. She made it to her car before she let herself exhale. But she didn't cry. Not in the parking garage. Not where cameras might see. She sat in the driver's seat of her 2008 Civic and took 3 measured breaths, the same breathing technique she'd learned in combat medicine training, the same technique that kept you calm when everything around you was burning. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked like a ghost, pale and hollow, and she watched her own eyes as she spoke the words aloud to the empty car, her voice steady and low and glacial. Intimidation is what small men do when competence fails them. The steering wheel was cold under her palms. She sat there for 90 seconds, then started the engine and drove home. Tuesday came like it always did, rotating after her Monday night shift, her body running on coffee and habit and the specific exhaustion that only came from keeping someone alive while you were slowly being destroyed. She opened her locker at 6:47 p.m., preparing to start the night shift, and a piece of paper fell out. The handwriting was precise, printed on a label from a physician-grade printer, the kind Dr. Ashford had access to, the kind the pharmacy staff used for medication labels. The words were simple: night nurse nobody. Beneath the words was her family photo, the one she kept in her locker from Ethan's school play 3 years ago, when he was 14 and still believed his mother worked overtime shifts because she loved nursing. In the photo, Margaret had her arm around him in the school auditorium, both of them smiling, both of them real. Someone had taken a black Sharpie across her face, obscuring her features with violent lines, reducing her to nothing but a void. The locker room was empty except for one orderly restocking supplies 2 rows over, far enough away to pretend he hadn't seen anything. Margaret peeled the label off carefully, studying the handwriting, the precise lettering, the specific angles of the letters. She held the defaced photo in one hand and examined it without expression, the kind of examination a trauma surgeon performs during triage, clinical and detached and fully present. The damage was intentional. The photo had been selected specifically. The message was clear: you are nobody here. She walked to the nearest trash bin and deposited the label. Then she looked at the photo again. Ethan's smile was still bright, still whole. They could deface her face 1,000 times and it wouldn't touch that moment, wouldn't touch the reality of who she was when the doors to this hospital closed behind her at the end of her shift. She placed the photo back in her locker carefully, turned to face the empty lockers, and said to no one in particular, to everyone who might be listening, "You'll need better handwriting if you want me to believe a doctor didn't write that." The orderly 2 rows over suddenly became very focused on his restocking. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 3 days later, at 1:47 a.m., when Margaret was passing room for 47 with her medication cart and saw Dr. Ashford standing at the computer terminal outside the major's door, his back to her, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. The chart on the screen showed room for 47, the major's file, his medication history, his dosage records. Margaret froze in the hallway shadow, her cart behind her, her breath shallow and controlled. Dr. Ashford's fingers moved faster. Delete. Rewrite. Timestamp change. He was altering the records systematically, his administrator access code logging entries that never happened, dosages that were never administered, medications that existed only on paper. Margaret watched for 8 seconds before retreating silently back around the corner, her heart rate elevated but her expression unchanged. She spent the next hour in a supply closet, not crying, not trembling, but documenting. She wrote down times, initials, medication names she'd seen, patterns she'd noticed over 3 years. Propofol dosages that didn't match the bottles hanging on the 4-pole. Fentanyl records that were altered during her breaks. Dexmedetomidine orders that appeared in inventory but never in the major's actual care. She wrote in a small notebook she kept in her car, in handwriting no one would recognize as hers, building a file that she understood, on some level she'd learned in the special forces, was either going to save someone or get her killed. Over the next week, the patterns became impossible to ignore. Dr. Ashford began reassigning her schedule with casual precision, first moving her exclusively to room for 47, keeping her isolated with the comatose major and away from other patients. Then he restricted her access to the main medication dispensary, requiring her to submit requests through him personally. Then 3 incident reports appeared in her personnel file, all of them fabricated, all of them describing concerning behavior patterns and potential medication errors that had never occurred. She mentioned to another nurse, a woman named Chen who worked pharmacy, that something seemed off with the major's care. Chen was transferred to the pediatric ward within 48 hours. Margaret stopped mentioning anything to anyone and simply watched, simply documented, simply continued the meticulous work of keeping the Major alive while understanding that she was being systematically isolated, surrounded by a cage made of administrative protocol and falsified records and the clinical precision of a man who understood how to weaponize a hospital's own systems. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, fluorescent and endless. She kept her notebook in her car, buried under the spare tire, and she told herself that she was just a nurse, just someone doing her job, just a person trying to survive another shift. But her hands told a different story. Her hands, which had once held a major's hand as they waited for a medevac helicopter in the Hindu Kush, remembered exactly what it felt like to watch someone destroy you twice. The medication discrepancies started small. A 10 mg dose of propofol hanging on the 4-pole, but the chart logged 15 mg. A fentanyl infusion set at 25 micrograms per hour, yet the record showed 40. Margaret had been a combat medic for 12 years. She knew the difference between careless documentation and deliberate falsification. She knew the difference between a mistake and a pattern. Room for 47 was quiet at 3:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. The Major lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator, his face slack in the way of the profoundly unconscious. Margaret stood at the medication cart with the chart open on the rolling computer station, and her eyes moved between the physical 4 bags, labeled, dated, initialed, and the electronic record that contradicted them. A discrepancy every 2 days. Always during Dr. Ashford's shifts. Always by a margin significant enough to matter, but small enough that a casual glance would miss it. She photographed the chart with her phone. Not to report it. Not yet. Just to have proof that she wasn't imagining the pattern. Her hands, which had once calibrated for drips under fire in a patrol base outside Sanjan Valley, remembered how to catalogue evidence without leaving fingerprints on it. Documentation was everything in the military. So was knowing when to stay silent until you had all the pieces. The fluorescent lights above hummed their relentless song. Margaret closed the chart and checked the Major's vital signs: blood pressure stable at 118/76, heart rate holding at 62, oxygen saturation at 98% on the current vent settings. Everything within normal range. Everything that would satisfy a physician's rounds. Everything that would make no one look closer. But that wasn't what scared her. What scared her was what was happening underneath the numbers that no one else was monitoring. The next morning, Margaret arrived for her shift to find a new assignment list posted outside the charge nurse station. Her name appeared only once: room for 47. The patient she'd been caring for 3 nights a week had been reassigned to another nurse. The dialysis patient who'd become stable enough to joke during his treatments, reassigned. The post-op cardiac surgery patient who'd requested Margaret specifically for his night care, reassigned. She'd gone from managing 6 patients across the ICU to being exclusively, singularly, tethered to one. The charge nurse was Karen Chen, who'd worked with Margaret for 2 years without incident. Karen's face was careful when Margaret approached the station. Dr. Ashford requested the change, Karen said quietly. He said room for 47 is complex and benefits from continuity of care. It was a lie dressed in medical logic. Margaret felt the accuracy of it like a knife, smooth enough that it would cut without resistance. Continuity of care was a legitimate reason. It was also impossible to argue against without sounding defensive. Without sounding like she had something to hide. Did he say why? Margaret asked. I can't provide continuity for other patients too. Karen's jaw tightened. He said you've been showing excessive attachment to this particular case. That it might be affecting your objectivity with other assignments. The words hung in the recycled hospital air. Excessive attachment. Affecting objectivity. In Margaret's personnel file, these phrases would transform into something else, something that would look, in a courtroom or a licensing board hearing, like instability. Like the kind of nurse who couldn't maintain professional boundaries. Like exactly the kind of nurse you'd have to terminate. Margaret took one measured breath. The ventilator in room for 47 wheezed its mechanical rhythm through the station's intercom, a ghost of sound from 3 corridors away. She'd learned the vocabulary of controlled response a long time ago, in places where losing your composure meant someone didn't make it to the medevac. Where flinching cost lives. I understand, she said to Karen. I'll adjust my approach. But she didn't adjust. What she did was watch. Over the next week, Margaret noticed the deterioration in ways that no monitor alarm would catch. The Major's oxygen saturation had dropped incrementally, 98% on day 1, 97% on day 2, 96% by day 5. Not critical. Not alarming. Not enough to trigger a response protocol. But a direction. A trajectory. The kind of slow decline that looked like natural disease progression unless you were paying attention to the baseline. More concerning was the sound. Margaret had spent enough nights in a combat surgical unit to recognize the acoustic signature of airway compromise. When she leaned close during her evening assessments, she could hear it, a subtle stridor in the Major's breathing, the sound of air being forced through narrowed passages. Scar tissue. Old tracheal damage from an intubation complication that had never been properly managed, now calcifying, now restricting the airway like a hand slowly closing around a windpipe. 3 days of observing this. Margaret documented it in her shift notes in precise, objective language, patient breathing pattern increasingly labored. Audible stridor noted on auscultation. Recommend ENT evaluation to rule out tracheal stenosis. She submitted a formal consultation request through the electronic system. The approval came back the next morning, but not in the way she'd hoped. The request was marked, denied. Reason, no clinical indication. Nurse Walsh is overstepping her scope. The note was signed by Dr. Marcus Ashford, MD, attending physician, critical care unit. Margaret sat in the break room at 7 a.m., holding a cup of black coffee that had gone cold, and read the response 3 times to make sure she hadn't misunderstood it. No clinical indication. The stridor was audible. The oxygen saturation was declining. The scar tissue was visible on the chart notes from his original admission. All of it was there. All of it was real. She tried a different approach. Dr. Robert Chen, the senior attending, not related to Karen, had seemed reasonable during his rounds. Margaret waited until he was finishing his assessment of room for 47, and she stepped into the doorway while he was writing his notes. Dr. Chen, I wanted to mention something about the Major's airway. There's a pattern of... Margaret. He looked up from the chart. His expression was careful. Guarded. Dr. Ashford already spoke with me about your concerns with this patient. He mentioned you've been exhibiting some emotional attachment that might be clouding your clinical judgment. The room felt smaller. The lights felt brighter. Margaret's hands remained steady at her sides because she'd learned, long ago, that the trembling wasn't fear. It was rage. And rage with a trigger could get people killed. I'm not exhibiting anything, Margaret said. Her voice was level. The voice of someone explaining a medication drip to a medical student. I'm documenting objective findings. I'm sure you are, Dr. Chen said, with the kind of gentleness that felt like condescension. But sometimes when we work closely with patients for extended periods, we can become invested in outcomes in ways that aren't always helpful. Maybe what this case needs is fresh perspective. Dr. Ashford's perspective. He turned back to his chart. The conversation was over. Margaret left the room. By Friday, the ICU director, Dr. Susan Meadows, had pulled Margaret into her office. The office was small and climate-controlled, with a window view of the Houston skyline and the kind of furniture that signaled authority. Margaret sat in the chair that faced the desk, the chair reserved for conversations about disciplinary matters and performance reviews. How are you doing, Margaret? Meadows started, and the question was warm enough to be dangerous. I'm fine, Margaret said. Work is good. The patients are. Dr. Ashford has brought some concerns to my attention. He's worried about you. About the intensity of your focus on room for 47. Meadows folded her hands on the desk. He says you've been resistant to reassignment, that you've submitted multiple consultation requests that seem outside your scope, that you may be dealing with some personal issues that are affecting your professional judgment. Margaret felt the web closing. It was built with precision. Each strand was thin enough to be defensible individually. Together, they would hold. I submitted one consultation request, Margaret said. Based on clinical observations. A patient's oxygen saturation is declining. His airway is compromised. Standard protocol is to. I know what standard protocol is, Margaret. I've been practicing medicine for 32 years. Meadows leaned back in her chair. What I'm concerned about is whether you're in the right headspace to be working in critical care right now. Maybe you need some time. A week or two. Just to reset. Get some perspective. It wasn't an order. It was phrased as a suggestion. But the subtext was clear: accept this voluntarily, or Dr. Ashford will push for something more formal. More documented. More damaging. Margaret left the hospital at 11:30 a.m. on a Friday with her shift incomplete and her professional judgment officially questioned in writing. She didn't go home. She drove to Herman Park instead, parked near the golf course, and sat in her car while the November rain began to fall. It came down hard, drumming against the roof in a rhythm that sounded almost like helicopter rotors. Almost like the sound of rescue arriving too late. 6 years ago, she'd walked away from the military after the Hindu Kush operation went sideways. After she'd called the advance order wrong and gotten her spotter, Vickers, killed. After she'd taken the blame at the court-martial instead of letting the major go down for an error that wasn't entirely his. She'd taken her discharge and her PTSD diagnosis and changed her name back to Walsh, her maiden name, because Margaret Reyes felt too much like someone else. Someone who'd made lethal decisions and lived with the consequences. She'd never told her sister where she really was those years. Never told her 17-year-old son Ethan, who thought his mother had worked logistics jobs overseas, administrative positions, the kind of work that explained the nightmares and the way she sometimes went rigid at sudden sounds. She'd chosen Sacred Heart in Houston because it was far enough from the military bases that she could disappear into the work. Just a nurse. No history. No rank. No classified operations or official records. No one asking questions about the gaps in her story. She hadn't planned on recognizing the major in room for 47. The rain fell harder. Margaret's hands, resting on the steering wheel, were dry. Steady. The same hands that had held a major's hand 6 years ago while they waited for the medevac to arrive, while the Hindu Kush night closed around them, while she told him she'd lied to the court-martial board. She'd said the advance order was hers. She'd said she'd misread the terrain. She'd said he was following orders and shouldn't go down for her mistake, when the truth was more complicated and less defensible than either of their careers needed to know. Now he was lying in room for 47 with scar tissue strangling his airway, and the physician orchestrating his slow decline was building a file thick enough to remove the only person who might still be watching him closely enough to catch it. Margaret could leave. She could accept the forced time off, find a position at another hospital, disappear into another city's healthcare system where no one knew her name or her history. She'd done it before. Or she could go back inside the building and stay close to the major, no matter what it cost. She started the car. The wipers beat against the rain like a heartbeat. She pulled back onto the main road and drove towards Sacred Heart, where the emergency department was already moving into its shift change, where room for 47 waited in the quiet hours of early evening, where a comatose major was suffocating one breath at a time while a physician falsified records and a hospital administration prepared the paperwork to remove the one nurse who'd noticed. Margaret pulled into the parking garage at 6:47 p.m., took the elevator to the 4th floor, and clocked back in at the time station. Karen Chen looked up from the charge desk, shocked. "Margaret, you're not scheduled until..." "I'm staying," Margaret said. "Room for 47 needs someone who's paying attention." Karen's face went carefully neutral. But before Margaret could walk away, Karen leaned close and lowered her voice to barely a whisper. "The major's O2 sat dropped to 93% about 2 hours ago." Dr. Ashford said it was the vent settings and adjusted them. But Margaret, his stridor is worse. I heard it myself. Margaret's jaw tightened. 93%. That was past concerning. That was the trajectory of an airway that was closing. She moved to wardroom for 47, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself think about what she would have to do if the Major's saturation dropped below 85%. What she would have to do if the system that was supposed to protect him had already decided he was a lost cause not worth saving. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. The monitors beeped their steady confirmation of vital signs that were beginning to tell a different story than anyone was willing to read. And Margaret Walsh, who had once been called Reaper 06, pulled up a chair next to the bed and settled into wait. The monitors beeped their steady confirmation of vital signs that were beginning to tell a different story than anyone was willing to read. And Margaret Walsh, who had once been called Reaper 06, pulled up a chair next to the bed and settled into wait. She didn't have to wait long. At 3:47 a.m., the Major's oxygen saturation began its final descent. The numbers on the monitor dropped like a stone down a well: 94, 89, 82, 74. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the air wasn't moving where it needed to go. The scar tissue in his airway, the tissue that Dr. Ashford had deemed not critical, had begun to collapse. The Major's chest was rising and falling with increasing desperation, each breath a labor, each breath shallower than the last. Alarms shrieked across the unit. Red lights pulsed. Margaret was already moving before her conscious mind caught up to what her hands already knew. 23 years in medicine, for combat deployments, 2 tours as a trauma medic under fire, muscle memory didn't hesitate. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook when lives were on the line. She reached for the trauma shears from her pocket. The ones with Reaper 06 engraved on the handle in military-precise lettering. The one she'd carried since 2006, since the Hindu Kush, since the day Vickers died trusting her judgment. The metal was cool and familiar against her palm. "Step back, nurse." Dr. Ashford's voice from the doorway, clinical and calm. "I'm calling the code team." Margaret didn't acknowledge him. The Major's oxygen saturation read 58. 58. At 40, brain damage becomes permanent. At 30, there is no coming back. The code team was 6 minutes away. The Major had 90 seconds. She swabbed the Major's neck with chlorhexidine in 3 smooth motions. Palpated the cricothyroid membrane, that thin space between cartilage rings where a trained hand could create an airway in the seconds before death. The skin was cool beneath her fingers. She could feel his pulse hammering against her index finger. Fear. His body remembering survival even in unconsciousness. "You do not have authorization for that procedure," Dr. Ashford said. His voice remained steady. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't moving. He was watching. Margaret placed the shears against the membrane. 1 vertical incision, perpendicular to the trachea. The blade was sharp. Military grade. Meant for this exact moment, this exact emergency, this exact choice between protocol and life. The skin opened like a whisper. 45 seconds elapsed. Blood. Not much. The antiseptic mixed with copper as she widened the opening with her gloved fingers. She could hear Dr. Ashford speaking behind her, but the words weren't reaching her anymore. There was only the Major, only the airway, only the 60 seconds remaining before permanent damage. She inserted the endotracheal tube, size 7.5, the measurement she'd calculated 3 days ago when she'd first suspected this crisis was coming. The tube slid past the vocal cords with barely any resistance. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a surgeon who'd performed this procedure on sand-covered tables lit by emergency flares, while mortars fell beyond the perimeter. The bag valve mask connected. She squeezed it once. The Major's chest rose. Again. His oxygen saturation climbed, 62, 68, 75, 82, 88. The monitor's rhythm shifted from desperate to steady. The alarms stopped their screaming. The room went dead silent except for the rhythmic hiss of the ventilator doing what it should have been doing all along. 90 seconds. That's all it took. Margaret stepped back from the bed, and that's when she saw them. Dr. Ashford standing in the doorway with two hospital administrators beside him, a man and a woman she didn't recognize, both holding tablets, both watching her with expression somewhere between shock and something colder. Administrative faces. The kind of faces that documented things. "You performed a surgical procedure without authorization," Dr. Ashford said, his voice steady and clinical, as if he were discussing the weather. As if she hadn't just brought a man back from the edge of death. "You violated multiple protocols. You endangered this patient's life without a physician's order. You acted outside your scope of practice." He handed her a folder. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. She could see the pages inside, a thick, official, already printed. Already dated. The termination paperwork. The written notice. The severance agreement. All prepared. All waiting. All brought to the ICU at 3:47 a.m. with two witnesses, as if he'd known exactly when the major would crash. As if he'd been waiting for her to save him so he could prove she'd violated every rule in the hospital manual while doing it. "Security will escort you from the building," he continued. "Your badge access is revoked as of now. Your personal effects will be boxed and held for pickup. We will be filing a formal report with the Texas Board of Nursing. You may expect contact regarding credential review within 30 days. The words were smooth. Professional. The words of a man who'd already won before the game even started. Margaret understood then, he'd isolated her for this exact moment. Assigned her exclusively to the major so that when the crisis came and the code team was unavailable and death was 30 seconds away, she would have to choose between watching a man die and violating the protocols he'd designed to trap her. She'd made the right choice. The major was breathing. His sinus rhythm was holding. The tube would be surgically secured in radiology, and he would live. And she was fired. Security arrived at 3:52 a.m. Two officers she'd never seen before, moving with professional courtesy, not unkind but unmovable as walls. They walked her through the ICU corridors at 4 a.m. when the hospital was at its quietest, when there were only skeleton staff on the floors and machines keeping vigil over the dying. Her badge was removed before the first elevator door closed. By the time they reached the lobby, her access codes were already disabled. They carried her cardboard box. Inside was the cracked coffee mug someone had given her 5 years ago that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A succulent she'd been keeping alive on the break room shelf, brown and withering now, given up on water like she'd been given up on employment. And a photograph, 4 by 6 inches, worn at the edges from being carried in breast pockets and footlockers. Her spotter, Vickers. Dead 13 years. Smiling in that photo like he had no idea the next operation would be his last. Dawn broke over Houston, gray and heavy with rain. Margaret sat at the bus stop 3 blocks away, cardboard box beside her on a bench that was already slick with water. She pulled out her phone with hands that had finally stopped shaking and scrolled through apartment listings. Anything cheaper than where she was living now. Anything that didn't require a hospital job reference. A studio in the Bellaria neighborhood. A 1-bedroom near the airport with noise warnings. A basement apartment that advertised high ceilings, which probably meant 6 feet 2 inches of clearance if she was lucky. She could make it 2 months on her severance. Maybe 3 if she picked up per diem work at clinics in other cities. But Sacred Heart had already filed with the Board of Nursing. Other hospitals would see that filing before they saw anything else. The phone conversations with HR would go one direction only. The rain fell harder. It hammered against the bus shelter like applause for a performance no one had wanted to watch. Margaret held the photograph of Vickers and let the water bead off the plastic covering. He'd trusted her judgment in the Hindu Kush. She'd made the call to advance their position when the intelligence suggested clear ground ahead. The intelligence had been wrong. A coordinated ambush. Vickers took shrapnel meant for her. Bled out in 20 minutes despite everything she did, everything she knew, everything her hands could manage. She'd told the court-martial board it was her decision. She'd told them she gave the order. She'd told them Vickers was following command, not his own instinct. The major had let her take the fall rather than admit they'd both made the call together. 6 years ago. And she'd been working in his ICU room ever since, keeping him alive, asking nothing, saying nothing, just pushing a chair up to his bed and waiting. Now she was waiting at a bus stop in the rain with a box that held everything she owned that mattered. The next bus came at 5:47 a.m. Margaret stood, picked up the cardboard box, and was reaching for the handrail when her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, "Check your email." She didn't check it. Not yet. Not while her hands were still cold from the rain and her mind was still in the ICU with the major's chest rising and falling in rhythm with the ventilator. Not while she was still pretending she hadn't just lost the only job that had ever made sense to her, the only place that had ever felt like atonement. But she would check it. Because that single text, "Check your email," was the first time in 6 years that anyone had acknowledged that Reaper 6 was something more than a name engraved on trauma shears. The bus doors hissed open. Ethan burst through the Sacred Heart lobby doors at 8:47 a.m., breathless from running, carrying a shadow box like it was made of glass. His mother's shadow box. The one she'd hidden in the attic 6 years ago and never mentioned once. Inside, behind protective acrylic, lay a silver star medal catching the fluorescent light, a 5-point star hanging from a ribbon striped in red, white, and blue. Beside it, her formal citation, the words crisp and official, "For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in the Hindu Kush, Major Margaret Walsh provided trauma care under sustained enemy fire, saving 14 lives over a 9-hour engagement." He'd overheard Mrs. Chen from the pharmacy in line at Starbucks. She'd told her friend what happened. How the night nurse, the quiet one with the trauma shears, had been fired for saving a patient. How Dr. Ashford had been waiting for exactly that moment. How Margaret Walsh had just pushed a cardboard box into a bus at dawn like she was disposable. The lobby was still mostly empty, early morning, that grey space between the night shift and the day shift when hospitals hold their breath. Ethan's 17-year-old voice cracked slightly as he spotted the veteran security guard standing near the information desk. Torres. His name tag said Torres. His eyes had that particular clarity of someone who'd seen things. Someone who knew. "Excuse me," Ethan said. "I need to." Torres turned. His gaze dropped to the shadow box. Dropped to the medal. Stayed there for 2 full seconds. Then his entire body language transformed, spine straightening, shoulders rolling back, his right hand moving toward his chest in the muscle memory of a salute that was never quite forgotten. "Me," he called out, voice sharp and carrying across the lobby. "We have a decorated major here. Special Forces." His voice didn't waver. Didn't question. It stated fact. "Someone get administration. Now." The morning shift nurses stopped what they were doing. The receptionist's fingers froze over her keyboard. 3 housekeeping staff paused with their carts. The sound of Torres's voice, command voice, the kind that came from someone who'd worn the uniform, he made the entire lobby feel different. Smaller. Like everyone was suddenly standing in the presence of something they'd misunderstood. The hospital administrator arrived in 4 minutes wearing pressed slacks and a blazer that probably cost what Margaret made in a month. With him came a retired general, grey-haired and imposing, with the bearing of someone accustomed to being listened to. The general took the shadow box from Ethan's trembling hands like it was a relic. He opened it. He read the citation aloud, his voice steady and ceremonial in a way that made every word sound like history being recorded. "For extraordinary heroism during combat operations in the Hindu Kush, Major Margaret Walsh provided trauma care under sustained enemy fire, saving 14 lives over a 9-hour engagement." 14 lives. The number hung in the air like a physical thing. Then room 447's monitors flatlined for a moment. Not in the alarming sense, in the sense that everything else stopped. The major's eyes opened. 3 years of closed eyes, 3 years of machines breathing for him, and suddenly they opened. His voice came out raw from disuse, rasped from a throat that hadn't spoken since before Margaret had fired, since before the world had decided he was a lost cause, Reaper 6. The room didn't just go silent. The silence became something solid, something you could touch. Ethan's breath caught. The general turned toward room for 47. The administrator's expression shifted from confusion to something else, dawning comprehension that something vast was unfolding right in front of him. The major's voice came again, stronger, pulling oxygen from lungs that had been filled by machines. She took the blame. For my mistake. Told the board she gave the advance order. I let her. His eyes found Ethan's face. Where is she? The phone came out before anyone could move. Someone in the background, one of the morning staff, had recorded everything. The shadow box. Torres's salute. The citation read aloud. The major waking. The confession. The entire thing. Within 20 minutes it was on a social media feed titled "Decorated War Hero Fired for Saving Patient's Life." By noon it had 70,000 shares. By afternoon it had gone viral across 3 platforms. Comments poured in from military groups, nursing communities, medical ethics forums. This is why we lose good people. This is why no one trusts hospitals. Fire Ashford, not her. Dr. Ashford arrived at Sacred Heart at 2 p.m. for his shift and walked directly into a nightmare. His face, Margaret would have described it as the color of someone who suddenly understood that gravity applied to him too, drained in real time. He watched the monitors in the administrative office showing the video on loop. He watched his own expression on the recording as the major spoke. He watched his own silence as the implications hit him. By 4 p.m., his hospital administrator access was revoked. His credentials went into immediate suspension. By 5 p.m., Dr. Catherine Marks, the surgical ethics legend who had mentored him through medical school, who had written the letter of recommendation that got him hired at Sacred Heart, who had shaped his entire professional foundation, released a public statement that spread through the medical community like a controlled burn. I taught Dr. Ashford that medicine requires moral courage. He learned the skills but abandoned the principles. He chose institutional protection over patient welfare. I disown him professionally and personally. That statement triggered everything else. The board review. The internal investigation. The discovery of the medication record alterations, not just for the major, but reaching back through his patient files, showing a pattern of systemic falsification. 43 patients. The equipment purchase scheme that netted him nearly $200,000 in kickback payments from a medical supply vendor. The deliberate sedation of the major to mask prior medical mismanagement. The 6 calls he'd made to the nursing director specifically requesting Margaret's removal. The prepared termination paperwork he'd already drafted before the emergency even happened, proof that he'd been manufacturing the justification for weeks. By midnight, news trucks were parked in the Sacred Heart parking lot. Security cameras captured Dr. Ashford sitting in his car, watching the floodlights illuminate the hospital entrance, watching his career implode on screens around the country. His phone rang. Once. Twice. 17 times total before he stopped counting. Former colleagues. The medical board. His wife's attorney. At 7 a.m. the next morning, the hospital CEO held a press conference on the front steps. She stood at a lectern with the hospital's seal and read a statement apologizing to Major Margaret Walsh, announcing a full ethics investigation, expressing the hospital's shame that a decorated veteran had been treated this way, that a nurse of her caliber had been retaliated against for witnessing misconduct. She didn't say Dr. Ashford's name. She didn't have to. Everyone knew. The medical board summoned him for a hearing in 72 hours. He never made it to the building. His resignation came via email at 3 a.m., 3 days later. A 2-word email, "I resign." The state board revoked his medical license anyway, 30 days after that, with a notation that would follow him forever: license revoked due to systematic patient endangerment, falsification of medical records, and violation of the fundamental principles of medical ethics. 6 months later, someone spotted him working the front desk at an animal clinic on the south side of Houston. Checking in pets. Filing paperwork. Making phone calls to schedule appointments. No longer a doctor. No longer anyone's authority. Just another person at a desk, interchangeable with the next person who could answer a phone. Margaret didn't track this information. She didn't need to. The hospital community is small. Information travels. What she focused on instead was what stood in front of her on the 4th floor of Sacred Heart in a new office with windows overlooking the Houston skyline, a nameplate reading Major Margaret Walsh, ICU Patient Advocacy Director. Files on her desk representing 3 patient safety reports she'd already filed, 3 cases she was tracking, 3 nurses who'd come to her door trembling with information about things they'd witnessed and didn't know how to report. The first was a young nurse, scared, with hands that trembled when she held a pen. She'd knocked on Margaret's door on a Thursday afternoon and said, "I think Dr. Summers altered a chart. I don't know how to prove it, but I know what I saw." Margaret had listened. She'd taken notes. She'd documented every word. And then she'd said something she wished someone had told her 6 years ago, something that might have changed the trajectory of her entire life. "You did the right thing coming here. Now we document everything. We build the case. We protect the patient. And we protect you." The nurse had cried then, not because she was weak, but because she wasn't alone anymore. Because someone with authority and experience had believed her immediately. The Major, Captain James Reed now, the title a compromise that let him keep his dignity, visited Margaret's office every Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. carrying 2 coffees from the same place near the hospital. Light roast, black, the way she liked it. He walked with a cane, his left leg still carrying the memory of sepsis, his voice still carrying the rasp of 3 years of silence. But he walked. He spoke. He was alive because a nurse with trauma shears and military training had made a choice in the dark. "I still owe you an apology," he said every Tuesday. "You paid it 3 years ago when you woke up," she said every Tuesday. But she let him keep trying because some people need the ritual of trying, and Margaret understood that better than most. Ethan visited her office on Wednesdays after school, proud in a way that only 17-year-old boys can be, ready to tell anyone in the hallway that his mother was a major, that his mother had saved 14 lives, that his mother was a hero. Margaret never corrected him. She just made sure his coffee was cold and his presence was noted. He'd missed knowing his mother for 6 years. She intended to make sure he didn't miss knowing her anymore. On a Friday evening when the ICU was quiet, just the monitors casting their green shadows across the walls, Margaret stood at the nursing station and looked at the face of a new patient in room 312. Young. Trauma case. Fractured femur, pneumothorax, contusion pattern suggesting something violent had happened. The kind of patient that most hospital systems would process and move on from, another file, another number. But Margaret had learned that every person in these beds was somebody's answer to "Where is she?" She'd learned that silence could be either permission or complicity. She'd learned that power, true power, wasn't in titles or in making decisions that looked good on paper. Power was in showing up at 2 a.m. when nobody was watching. Power was in reading the medication chart carefully. Power was in asking the question nobody else wanted to ask. That evening she told the new trauma nurse, the one with steady hands but uncertain confidence, the fundamental truth she'd learned across 6 years of night shifts and court-martials and firings and vindication: power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. The nurse nodded. She understood. And somewhere in the Houston night, the monitors beat their steady rhythm, and the work continued. If you made it this far, you already know that doing the right thing doesn't always feel right in the moment. It feels like isolation. Like risk. Like standing alone. But you also know now what happens when you keep standing. When you don't flinch. When you let your competence speak louder than your voice. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about the ones who change everything. The ones you didn't see coming.